It's time for another Keystone Kindergarten, and today we're re-entering Grim Batol, a revamped dungeon coming into Season 1 of the War Within expansion. I'm Frank and we'll ride some dragons to victory in this updated version of the dungeon. The dungeon will start off with Twilight Brutes and Earth Callers. Twilight Brutes have a simple tank smasher and brutal strike, but will also Obsidian Stomp to cause earth scrolls under players' feet to watch out for. Twilight Earth Callers will have a standard Earth Bolt, but you should assign someone to watch for Mass Tremor, which will be a large AoE to hit the group. Usually hidden above the corpses of red dragons will be Twilight Destroyers. Be very careful to learn where they hide, as they can really mess up your pool if they surprise you. They will cast a Twilight Flame on non-tanks in the group that will have a healthy dot attached to it, but also leave a puddle of purple every 2 seconds, so dance slightly around while ticking away. They also cast Umbral Wind, an AoE knockback that can easily send you off the edges of the walkways. The graphic is somewhat misleading for the spell, as it leads you to think you need to leave the dome of the spell effect, but this isn't the case and hits equally hard anywhere within 60 yards. Knowing that, try and always position your back against the wall for the knockback, or just line of sight it and avoid the hit altogether. The generals of the area are known as Twilight Overseers, who will rive the tank with a harsh chunk worth of health, which can also stack higher for more deadly hits. Overseers can also cast Reckless Tactic, which affects everyone around them, increasing damage done by 20% and increasing the mob's damage taken by 10%. You may want to prioritize getting these down, but you can de-enrage the mob you're most worried about too. After clearing out a few of these Twilight packs, you'll free 5 red dragons that can be mounted for a mini vehicle combat game. If you've done this dragon run in the past, you would fly over a large majority of the dungeon to clear out packs with countless bombs, but this has changed for the M+ version of the dungeon. First, your dragons will turn back after reaching the first boss, and second, you'll only have 5 engulfing flames to drop on the trash, which knock out about 10% of the health of the mobs in the area. That said, you'll have an unlimited Searing Ember to knock out 2% of health to fill in between. Coordinate as a group to do the most damage possible with all of your collective bombs to make clearing the upcoming trash much faster. Whatever you have left from the bombing run will stand between you and your first boss, General Umbriss. General Umbriss has some tricks up his sleeve, and you'll need to pay close attention to your surroundings to survive this fight. The main mechanic of this fight is Commanding Roar, which will chunk everyone in the group and call down drakes to swoop the battlefield with Shadow Breath. There are 4 lanes for which they'll possibly spawn through, but only 3 will be active during each pass. For each roar, there'll be 2 flyovers, so always keep an eye on when the floor turns purple for the second pass. Where things get more difficult is the sets of rock spikes he will place on random players in the group. These are only a minor health knockdown, but they'll leave behind rumbling earth, taking damage to anyone passing through it, but also slowing players down for 30% inside the effect. So being tactical about where you place in these circles is important to being able to get around the 4 zones of Shadow Breath. Lastly, tanks will be dealing with the Tankbuster Skull Splitter, which is a 3-hit smash that will try and land on the tank. With all the movement, this means you could be facing away from him during these hits, and this is important because the attacks also leave behind a bleed that can stack every time Umbriss successfully lands a hit of Skull Splitter. So try and use blocks and the like during this to avoid stacking up bleeds. The door will drop after defeating Umbriss and you'll enter the inner ring of the dungeon. Before we talk about the mobs, you should have an eye on the second boss at all times, as he will be patrolling back and forth and also spawn fire swirls when not patrolling. You'll first encounter Twilight Beguilers, who will have a spam Shadow Flame Bolt cast, but the one thing you'll want to watch for interrupting is Sear Mind, which, once cast, will channel into someone, stunning them for the duration of the channel. These usually come with 2 or 3 in the pack, so kick rotations are critical. These will usually be accompanied by a Molten Giant, who sometimes appears to be locked down by their fellow Beguilers. They'll cast a Molten Wake, which clips everyone in the group and increases fire damage taken by 20%, the latter part seeming to try to stop players from wanting to ever pull multiple of these together. Tanks should also watch this debuff because the Tank Smasher Lava Fist hits hard and will hit that much harder with the debuff. Another new mob in this area is the Twilight Flame Render, who will point a purple line called Blazing Shadow Flame that will erupt into fire on the floor after a second or 2. And tanks will just have to be careful with Shadow Flame Slash, a semi-strong hit that will leave a lingering burn that can stack. But before you even meet some of these mobs, you'll run into the patrolling Forgemaster Throngus. This fight has 3 distinct phases, and as the boss forges weapons to move into a new phase, healers will be challenged with blistering heat blasts throughout the channel. The first weapon he will draw is his axe. The group will want to watch for Fire Cleave, which will leave fire in a cone, eating up precious space of the arena, so players should try and bait it somewhere safe. Throngus will then move into forging their sword, which will bring about a cast of Molten Flurry, smashing the tank up and flinging molten sparks onto the other players. These sparks will drop Molten Spark Pool, also eating up space needed in the fighting area, so the team should stick close and try to overlap pools and save space. The final weapon to be forged is the mace, which will cause the boss to increase melee damage by 1000% but move 50% slower. This is why the available room in the fight area is so critical, because the tank will have to kite the boss for more than 10 seconds without letting the boss get into melee range for one-shots. Oh, and Throngus will also drop molten spark pools for each step he takes during the chase. Rotate through these 3 weapons without running out of space, and you'll be moving along. The trash in this area will start to get more scary, starting with Twilight Lava Benders. Lava Benders will have a line frontal named Shadow Lava Blast, that on a tight walkway can be problematic. They'll force the group to disperse from one another with Dark Eruption, and at 40% health left, they'll use Ascension to gain an aura that will hit players every 2 seconds with an AoE, so burn them quickly when they hit this point. Twilight Enforcers are simple but deadly for the tank. They will very quickly stack Ramping Rage, increasing 30% attack speed several times over before you know it. Save a stun to use it around 50% or even sooner to stop this from stacking too high. Twilight Warlocks have a very nasty curse called Enveloping Shadow Flame. 2 players will get a curse that creates a healing absorb that will cover large majority of their health pool. This is removed with decurse, so do your healer a favor and quickly remove them with your abilities. And I should mention that there are packs where 2 Warlocks are in a pool, so almost the entire group can be cursed. In between these envelops, the Warlock will spam a somewhat deadly Shadow Flame bolt. After avoiding some surprise dragons and sleeping mobs, you'll approach the 3rd boss, Drahga Shadowburner. Starting with phase 1, things are fairly simple. She'll have a Shadow Flame bolt that can be interrupted to give the healer a chance to sneak in some DPS. She'll also throw out 2 Curse of Entropy randomly, which will tick for 20 seconds, unless the player has their 30% healing absorb shield removed, or this is decursed. The main mechanic of the fight is Invocation of Shadow Flame, where in phase 1, Drahga will summon an invoked Shadow Flame spirit that will fixate onto one player. Should the spirit reach that player, they instantly cast Shadow Flame Nova, nuking the group, and you'll be staring down the barrel of a wipe. You may be fooled into thinking this is a quick fight, but once Drahga hits 0%, she'll run and jump off a cliff, only to re-emerge riding the Drake Valiona and having a new health pool. Save your cooldowns for this part of the fight because phase 2 is more chaotic and challenging. For starters, now Drahga will summon 2 invoked Shadow Flame spirits, causing chaos as your group tries to ensure both don't reach their target. They are CCable, so coordinating with your pug before the pull will make this much more manageable. But Valiona now adds Drake abilities to this fight, starting with Twilight Buffet, which will knock everyone back. This can be cast when spirits are out, so be sure not to get knocked back into your spirit for a Nova or it could spell disaster. Whenever a Twilight Buffet is cast, she will also spawn 4 Twilight Winds that will clip you for some damage and also slow you down as you run around the arena. Valiona will also do your typical Dragon's Breath towards the tank, called Devouring Flame, catching you off guard as you try to melt the spirits chasing your friends. Good news is once you get Valiona down to 50%, she will abandon Drahga and the fight will end. The final hallway toward the last boss only has 2 new mobs. The Faceless Corruptor is the more deadly of the 2, having 2 abilities. Mind Piercer will spawn tentacles to launch up from swirls, and should they hit you, you'll take big damage and be charmed for 10 seconds. Corrupt will choose a random player and attempt to drain all their life, meaning the healer needs to focus heal that target heavily during this cast. The other mob is a mutated Hatchling, with only a Shadow Wound ability, a stacking 5% shadow damage debuff that will play a big part in the next boss. Speaking of, our final boss of this dungeon is Erudux, the Duke of Below. This boss has a dance that can get very chaotic very quickly, so let's jump straight into the 2 main mechanics. The first is Void Surge, where Erudux will cause AoE damage to the group, but also spawn Void Tendrils all over the room. If you touch one of these tendrils, you'll be affected by Death's Grasp, which will lock you in place for 4 seconds and take some serious damage. Get caught in one of these during other mechanics, and it could result in a wipe. The second is Shadow Gale, where Erudux will collapse Shadow at a location in the room, taking 15 seconds to close in. Tanks will have to use context clues to try to determine where in the room that circle will be, while tiptoeing around the tendrils. Once the circle is formed, anyone left outside will get hit with deadly shadow damage almost immediately. While this Shadow Storm is happening, Erudux will also choose 3 random players to have Abyssal Corruption. This is just going to hurt anyone that stands within the circle for somewhat manageable damage, but you want to try to have the 3 people spread out while the other 2 don't overlap any of the circles, while also avoiding tendrils in the small area. Walking through this corruption is a far less deadly thing to do than walking into a tendril or walking out into the Shadow Storm, so choose your movement wisely. After the gale ends, Erudux will use Void Infusion to break out several mutated hatchlings. Tanks try to gather these up without tripping over any tendrils, but DPS need to get these hatchlings down quickly because their Shadow Wound ability will make the tank take more shadow damage for the boss's final spell. While all this chaos is going on, the tank will need to also anticipate Erudux's Crush. It will hit for a large portion of physical and shadow damage, which is amplified by hatchlings and their wounds. But it will also knock the tank backwards, possibly throwing the tank into a tendril and locking them down. Tanks aren't very effective when they're stunned, so try to carefully position yourself to not get hit by a tendril when knocked back. Rinse and repeat this a couple times and you'll have completed Grim Batol. I'm Frank with the Mythic Dungeon League, and we appreciate you watching our guide to the revamped Grim Batol Mythic Plus dungeon. Keep an eye out for other Keystone Kindergartens for Season 1 of War Within, and we'll see you in the next key.